Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about a very important aspect of being a human, and that's our emotional lives. Emotions are extremely important to us as human beings, and even if you're one of those people that doesn't necessarily experience emotion as high highs and low lows, maybe you're somewhere in between, our emotional lives really provide the color for our experiences in life. When we think about emotions, um, we sometimes have difficulty defining them. We know what we mean when we talk about emotions, but the actual study of emotions is a relatively complicated thing. And you can see that by looking at the definition of emotion that's found in most general psych textbooks. This is our definition. Emotion is the response of a whole organism involving four things: physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, conscious experience, and something we don't think too much about, interpretation. Indeed, the expressive behaviors is what we tend to think about when we think about emotion, because we think about reading emotion on other people's faces, or our attempt maybe to hide our own emotions. Um, but we'll get to that in a second. Uh, In terms of the definition, the beginning part is a response of the whole organism. And the reason we don't say response of the human organism is because most psychologists would agree that a lot of animals have emotion. And indeed, mammals, we could probably assert, are most likely to have emotions similar to human beings. Frans de Waal is a very famous primatologist, and he recently came out with a book on animal emotions in which he detailed quite a lot of the evidence that animals do have emotions. For those of you that have a pet, particularly a pet dog, it's almost goes without saying that your dog experiences emotions. Of course, we can never be absolutely sure that a dog's happiness or a dog's guilt or sadness is the same as ours. But all the indications seem to be there that human beings are not the only organism that has an emotion. Scary guy. Um, with regard to emotion, we have to begin by simply saying that it's an extremely complicated thing to study. Again, we have the expression, we have the interpretation, we have the subjective experience, we have the physiological changes that are going on in our body. I don't know if you've ever seen the Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris. All of us have probably seen an image of the Mona Lisa. I don't know, live, it's kind of a disappointment. Usually, well, it's very small, and usually there's a huge crowd around, and of course there's a huge crowd of people around taking selfies of themselves with the Mona Lisa. That's our modern day and age tourism. If I get a picture, then it counts. But anyway, the Mona Lisa is at least famous partially because it's hard to read the emotion on her face. If you were looking at her face, what would you say is going on internally? Well, some people say she looks like she has an expression on her face that's kind of like, I know something you don't know, or maybe as she looks at you is like, really? Are you kidding me? You're that pathetic. Um, but the Mona Lisa, I think, stands as a good example of how reading emotion on people's faces isn't the same thing as assuming that they are having that emotion. If you're honest, you know that a lot of times you and I show emotions that we don't necessarily have. I may pretend that I'm happier than I am. I may be happy, but not as happy as I pretend. Maybe I deem that it's really important that this person in front of me really needs to see me happy. So um, it makes the study of emotion complicated. The six pictures on the left are the original set of pictures that were used in research, which went all over the world and asked people to read various faces and describe the emotion on them. And we'll get back to that in a second, but this original research was quite interesting. Now, just to begin our discussion, I want to talk about a psychologist who with many of his colleagues in the 1950s and 1960s mapped out or tried to map out um, an emotional, can we say, organization. And Plutchik and his colleagues, in studying emotion for several years, came up with what they called the 8 primary emotions. These would be the inside slices of our pizza here. And so beginning from the top right, acceptance, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, anticipation, and joy. So according to Plutchik, these are the 8 basic emotions that all the rest of our emotions are made out of. For those of you with maybe an art background, you know that there's this concept of primary colors, and so there's some basic primary colors. I think yellow is one. I think red is one. If I recall, green is another one. So there's primary colors, and all of the other colors, the 10,000 blues you could buy at Home Depot to paint your wall. Those are all subtle variations or combinations of the primary colors. So Plutchik used this idea to talk about emotions. So he simply said we start with 8 primary emotions. Now, psychologists these days, and you'll read about this in your textbook, have really expanded the 8 to 10, but I'll let you read about that. So it would be nice if in studying emotions we said, okay, there's 8 basic ones. Okay, we're done as long as we understand the 8. But as Plutchik and his colleagues quickly found that there's no way that those 8 slices of pizza emotion there account for the very rich and complicated life of what it means to be an emotional human being. And so Plutchik said, well, there's 8 secondary or I could call simple secondary emotions. These would be the ones on the outside, okay? So for instance, if you looked right at the top of our circle here, you can see love. And according to Plutchik, love would be a secondary emotion. Not that it's not extremely important, but love, according to Plutchik, would be some kind of combination of joy and acceptance. And again, think about anyone you love and any kind of love. There's a joy in that relationship, joy in being around that person, joy in thinking about that person, joy in anticipating seeing that person, and there's a certain amount of acceptance that comes along. And again, there could be all kinds of acceptance. Submission would be a combination of acceptance and fear. One I really like off to the right there is awe. I don't know if you can read that, it's a little fuzzy, but awe would be a combination of fear and surprise. So when I'm awed by something, there's a kind of like, whoa, surprise, but there's also kind of like a fear, maybe not a cringing fear, but just kind of like, whoa, this is a really amazing thing, and I really can't fathom this. So Plutchik said that there are 8, the slide in front of you says 8 secondary emotions, but let's just add, if you could add in 8 simple secondary emotions. These would simply be the emotions that are combined from 2 slices of emotional pizza next to each other. Now, that would be nice. We'd have 16, 8 primaries, 8 simple secondaries. But again, as Plutchik found, no way does that account for the richness and complexity of human emotion. The third aspect that Plutchik and his colleagues found was that when we study emotion, we have to, right off the bat, recognize that every emotion we have comes to us in an infinite possible set of complexities or intensities. In other words, think of sadness. Sadness is an emotion. All of us have experienced it. But sadness can range, if you look right here where sadness is, from the most profound grief that a human being could experience. And if we were to simply go from grief to maybe a more, not a profound grief, but a very, very serious grief, maybe more to a moderate sadness, maybe more to a mild sadness, all the way down to, I don't know, a kind of Monday morning sadness, or a kind of, I wish the trees were greener than they are kind of sadness. In other words, almost a sadness that we barely register emotionally. And we have to point out that the range of intensity that any emotion potentially can produce in us really is infinite. So this third aspect of Plutchik's studies really is what makes emotion very complicated to study. Because if I say I'm sad, you may have a vague sense of what I'm talking about, but what kind of sadness? What are we talking about here? Because sadness, again, or anger, or joy, or any of these things can really, really range from extremely mild to absolutely intense. Again, if we could stop here, at least we could get our handle around emotion. But it's even more complicated than that. Because the reality here is I mentioned that there's the simple secondary ones. Well, there's other combinations of emotion, what we might call secondary ones, in which there's, two. Again, if you could think of somebody you love, you not only love them, but I suspect that sometimes you're disappointed in them. Sometimes you're fearful of them or for them. Sometimes, you might be a little disgusted by them. Very rarely in life do you and I experience any one emotion, be it primary, be it secondary. No, the reality is our emotional lives are kind of like smoothies. We put a little rage, we put a little love, we put a little fear, we put a little of disgust, we put a little of joy, and our actual experience of emotion is almost always a complicated combination of emotions. And again, that's not only very complicating, but wait 5 minutes and your emotional subtly change. Again, we don't stay static with our emotional experience. Now, I want to say that there are exceptions to this. You may be going through or have gone through at some point in your life maybe a very, very difficult time, and your dominant emotion was, sadness for weeks and maybe months on end. Or you may have, if I could use an example, maybe fallen in love at some point, and maybe for weeks and months you were just joyful, and no matter what happened, you were just joyful all the time. So there are those experiences when one emotion dominates, but it doesn't last very long for most of us. So the myriad types of combinations that you and I experience and that we scroll through as we go through our emotional day are exceedingly complicated. And now, to put the cherry on top of the emotional pizza pie here, mixing my metaphors, here's the other big problem we have. A lot of our emotional life is not even in our conscious awareness. We have emotions, ladies and gentlemen, that we are not consciously aware of. All of us have had the experience. Maybe you're clicking around online, or you're reading a magazine, and you'll come up with, I don't know, some little advertisement that'll say, hey, take this test, how to know if you're depressed, or how to know if you're anxious. And we might say to ourselves, wait a second, how could I not know that I'm depressed? Well, you can. In fact, talk to most counselors and they'll say that the majority of people that are clinically depressed do not seem to be consciously aware of that. Now, how could this be? Well, you and I are raised in various environments that encourage us, for better or for worse, to deny certain emotions. So, for instance, let's say that you're a boy and you're raised in a household in which the rule is that men are not allowed to admit that they're afraid. They're not allowed to admit that they're anxious. And so essentially every time a little boy says something about fear, he gets the message pretty quickly. Don't admit to that. Pretend like you're not afraid. Put on your confidence face. Or maybe, to give another example related to gender, I think that might equally apply to girls. In our society and culture, women and girls are not supposed to be angry. Now, we have to admit that men are afraid and boys are afraid and women are angry. But if you're an angry woman, you'll get labeled pretty quickly, and it's not a positive label. And so sometimes I think little girls are socialized not to admit that things bother them. Oh, it's okay. No problem. It's okay. When really it wasn't. It was a big problem, and you were angry. So, or let's say that you go to a particular church, and in this particular church, if you're a good a member of the church, you're not supposed to be sad. You're supposed to go to church and praise the Lord, and you know. When someone says, "Hey, how you doing?" God is good all the time, and you're just supposed to be praising the Lord and happy and joyful. Well, I don't care what you believe in terms of your religious beliefs. No one is always joyful and always happy. Indeed, I love to read the Bible myself, and I have plenty of examples I could read if you are following the Bible where plenty of people weren't joyful and happy all the time. And if I could dare give the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who's not joyful. He's not laughing and saying, yeah, everything's great. No, he's praying and shedding great drops of tears and praying to God, his Father, if you could let this cup pass. Now, sermon over. What I'm trying to get at with Plutchik's 5 steps here is how ridiculously complicated the study of emotion is. And so if you are not in touch with your emotions, congratulations, you're a normal, regular human being. I am often surprised at my emotional life. And it's because of all of these kind of things. It's a complicated thing to sort out. Now, let's go through those 4 aspects of emotion that we began at the beginning with by saying that emotion involves physiological changes, emotional expression, subjective experience, and lastly, interpretation. This is the cool thing that we've discovered about emotion. Early on in the history of psychology, psychologists attempted to study emotion, and they kind of, on some levels, gave up a little bit because it was too complicated. Well, once we discovered that the psychological experience of every emotion has, by definition, physiological analogs. In other words, when I am joyful, the neurohormones in my bloodstream and the neurotransmitters in my brain change from when I'm having an emotion of sadness or I'm having an emotion of anger. Every single emotion has physiological parallels. And what's cool about this is that when we know what the physiological parallels are, we are not dependent upon asking people the emotion they're feeling. Rather, we can hook them up, either take a blood test or hook up their brain, whatever physiological mechanisms that we've discovered go along with certain emotions, and we can see that your brain is registering anger or frustration or anxiety or joy. Your bloodstream shows that the neurohormones in your bloodstream are high levels of stress hormones. And so you may not admit that you're anxious, but your bloodstream, and particularly the neurohormones, are telling us your body is anxious. Now, the physiological aspect of emotion can be looked at quite a lot, and I'll leave it to you to study some of these things. But so, for instance, if we look at the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, you may recall from our chapter on the brain, has sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, and they work kind of like an on-off switch. Maybe we should put more a dimmer switch that turns things on and a dimmer switch that slowly turns things off. So, for instance, the sympathetic aspect of the autonomic nervous system would be the arousing part. So, for instance, when you are excited, either a nervous excitement or a happy excitement, or you're angry, this is what happens. Your pupils dilate, your mouth goes dry, salivation slows down, we begin perspiring, sweating, your breathing rate is going to go up, your heart rate accelerates, your digestion slows down, and you're going to secrete stress hormones. And those things happen when you're stressed or when you're excited, happy, and you're all psyched about doing something with your friends. So here presents the challenge. Arousal stimuli, whether we consider them to be positive or negative in terms of our experience, have all the same physiological responses. On the other side, the parasympathetic division, when you're, chilling and you're happy and peaceful, or when you're depressed, here's what's going to happen. Your pupils are going to contract in your eyes. Your salivary glands are going to increase production in your mouth. Your skin is going to dry out. Your breathing rate is going to slow down. Your heart rate is going to slow down. Your digestion system is going to be activated. And there's going to be a huge decrease in the production of stress hormones. Now, this is just one example of emotional arousal. There are, again, you can take an entire class, you can get a whole PhD in the psychology of emotion. But I wanted to give you an illustration, and perhaps a great illustration of this is our next slide. It's really quite interesting the way these things work. So think of a lie detector test. Clearly, there's no device that can actually tell you if you're lying, but what a so-called polygraph does is poly meaning more than one, many, and graph, it takes these physiological responses to emotion and simply graphs them out. So it takes my perspiration and heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing changes, and in response to questions, it measures your response. And so what they'll do with a polygraph is simply ask you a bunch of baseline questions. What's today? Who's the president? That might get your heart rate going. What's your name, and so on and so forth, and see baseline measures. And then they'll ask you, did you kill so-and-so? The reality is, as human beings, the overwhelming majority of us, when we lie, and we know we're lying, it stresses us. And while we may be able to control our face and control our body, you can't control breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. It shows up in these micro changes. So it's an interesting application of this idea that emotion has physiological parallels. Now, you and I don't really pay attention sometime to those, but every once in a while you might. So I've certainly caught myself when I'm driving. So let's say I'm driving somewhere. Let's say I'm stressed about something. I'm thinking about it, and it's going back and forth in my mind, and all of a sudden I'll notice that I'm gripping the wheel of the driving wheel of my car so tightly my hands actually hurt. And I've been doing that for a while. And if you ask me, are you stressed? I'm like, no, I'm just thinking through something. But the tension in my muscles as I grip the wheel so much that my hands are almost, like squeezing it. I'm able to just say, wow, okay, take a deep breath and relax here. So physiological change is a very important aspect of our emotional lives. Now, the aspect of emotion that I find most interesting is whether we express emotion or not. Let me just lay out two things that psychologists have found. Number one is this. No matter where you go in the world, this is Ekman's research that you'll read about, and some of the photos that you see to the left of your screen there, these were some of the pictures. The original set were all white people, and so someone pointed out, well, we're taking all these pictures of white people around the world and asking people to identify the emotions. What if there was other ethnicities? And then again, they replicated this with every ethnicity, and they found exactly the same thing. Every single culture that this has been studied around the world, 32 cultures, I think Ekman and his colleagues' research, has found that there is universal agreement among human beings that certain facial expressions are indicative of the same emotions. So if you smile in New York, you smile in New Jersey, you smile in Madagascar, you smile in Kamchatka, you smile in Bali, no matter where you go in the world, a smile indicates joy. It doesn't indicate sadness. It doesn't indicate anger. On the basis of Ekman and others' research, psychologists have pretty much inferred that emotional expression is innate. In other words, we don't have to learn, take lessons. Hey, when you're happy, smile. Babies, when they're happy, smile. Babies, when they're angry, don't smile. They cry. So it seems to be innate to us as human beings. What doesn't seem to be innate is that every culture around the world does have all kinds of prescriptions and rules about the expression of emotion, namely when is appropriate, how much. There are rules in some cultures for children as opposed to adults, for men as opposed to women, for high status individuals as opposed to low status individuals, and on it goes. Clearly, when we look at emotional expression, we can, on the one hand, say that it is the same all over the world in terms of what facial expressions convey as far as the emotion goes. What's not the same is the actual expression of emotion in terms of place, time. There are restrictions. I was talking to someone recently who was in France, and they were talking about how it's so easy when they were in Paris walking around to see Americans, because Americans are loud and they're talking really loud, and the French are kind of looking at them like, these Americans. And again, I don't know why as Americans we have to always be laughing so loud and talking so loud and expressing, but that's one of the things that I think most people would say about American tourists is unlike people from elsewhere, we seem to be very, very emotionally expressive, obnoxiously so sometimes when we travel. Now, when we look at emotional expression, there seems to be some culturally universal things I'm saying. Here's again some of the same pictures. So if you're looking at the woman in picture A, of Plutchik's 8 primary emotions, that would be joy. Joy is a smile. There's tension in the cheeks. It tends to push our cheeks up. Our eyes get smaller. Surprise in B, you can see, is when you make your face as long as you possibly can. Our mouth usually drops. It's almost like we're trying to open our eyes as wide as we can to get as much visual information because our brain is saying, am I really looking at this? And so on. Every emotion has certain facial expressions. And again, surprise is surprise no matter where you go in the world. Anger is anger no matter where you go in the world. Now, there may be a culture in which it's not socially acceptable for certain people to express anger. And again, that doesn't mean that the person is not angry. It just means that we're culturally conditioned to hide that emotion, at least on our faces. Now, psychologists in studying emotion have come up with what they call 4 emotional display rules. And the first one, which we've just alluded to here, would be culture. Every culture and every subculture, again, whether we're talking about the Xhosa in South Africa, or we're talking about the Tamil in southern India, or we're talking about any cultural group has rules about culture and, about emotion, and when you show it, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how much you hide it. Some cultures seem to be more obviously emotionally expressive. If we could just chuck in stereotypes for a second, if we're going to Europe, the stereotype in Europe, it would be that for instance, Italians or the Greek would be much more obviously emotionally expressive, I'd say, than the British, with a stiff upper lip and all, or the Danish or the Norwegians. So culture does say something, and again, it doesn't mean that if you have a cultural background, you necessarily always confine yourself to the cultural rules. But culture does say a lot about who, when, how, why emotion is expressed. If I could just give you an example, this is so obvious. Go to a funeral anywhere in the world, and I'm telling you, you'll get very, very different displays of emotion. There are some funerals in which people are weeping and wailing and trying to throw themselves into the ground, and and there are other cultures in which there's a funeral and no one's even crying. Everybody's just standing there solemnly, and like if you were screaming and crying, and so culture and even subculture. Again, I don't know how many of you are listening to me go to a church, but every church has its kind of cultural or subcultural rules about, the expression of emotion, for instance, in the middle of a worship service. There are certainly some churches you go to where people are yelling out, "Amen," or they're very expressive emotionally. I've certainly been to other church services where everybody just sits there really quiet, and you're not supposed to express any emotion. So culture is really, really important in terms of that. Second set of display rules are family. All of us grow up in a family, and um, you and I learned in our family of origin um, uh, whether we were allowed to express emotion or not. And again, I remember as a kid, my parents did believe in spanking, and so my mom spanked me sometimes, but my mom is small and it didn't hurt very much. So when I get a little older, and I was deserving of a spanking, because I was quite often deserving of a spanking, when my dad would come home, uh, you know, I'd say every other day, I was he'd call me in and he'd explain to me, okay, I'm going to spank you. Here's what you did. Here's why. And he would always say, I love you. I'm not beating you, and so on and so forth. But when he was doing his explanation, I had to look at him in the eye, and I wasn't allowed to show any emotion. If I was smiling, he'd go, "What are you smiling about? I'll give you something to smile about." Or if I had an angry look, he'd go, "What are you angry about? I'll give you something to be angry." So the rule of my family was when your dad was giving you the speech before he spanked you, you had to look at him directly. You weren't allowed to look away. You had to look at me when I'm talking to you. And you had to keep this blank look. And I never listened to him. I was concentrating so hard on keeping my face blank because I didn't want the spanking to be worse. Uh, anyway, I remember as a kid thinking to myself, when I get older and I have kids and I spank them, if they want to be mad, I'm gonna say, okay, you can be mad. Anyway, I didn't spank my kids much, but every family has rules. Some families are loud and everybody's expressive and everybody's allowed to, others are very, close to the vest and no one's raising their voice and everybody is, not, your own family, and sometimes the family display rules are most obvious when you grow up and you marry someone whose family has really different emotional display rules. And that's one of those things that any marriage and family counselor is going to say has the potential to cause big problems as couples seek to navigate, can I say, the inevitable conflicts of relationships. And one is, grew up in a family where there was a lot of yelling, and the other's like, "Oh my goodness, that's abusive." So family display rules. A third set of display rules are what are called vocational display rules. And these are just the display rules that we agree to when we take certain roles on. So to give you an obvious example, if you're a cheerleader, let's say you're a professional cheerleader, or, think of professional cheerleaders. A professional cheerleader, by definition, needs to show a lot of very positive emotion. Okay, optimism and cheering and smiling a lot and jumping up and down. If you're a depressed cheerleader, you're not going to last very long. If you're going out there being all depressed and like, we probably won't win, our team sucks, you're not going to last very long. Maybe opposite of that is if you work at a funeral home. If you walked into a funeral home for a funeral and the funeral home director is like, "Hello, welcome to our funeral home. So glad you're here. Isn't it a nice day? Third door on the right. Thank you so much." You'd be like, "What is wrong with this guy?" No, a funeral home director, by definition, we expect to be, somber. They may say, "So sorry for your loss." Really? You think they're sorry? This is how they make a living. They're kind of happy. They're making money. But we don't want them to say that. We want them to pretend like, they're all dignified and they're sad for us. Every single role or job you and I take on comes with it an expectation. I don't know if you've ever worked in retail, but I have. And I'd say that about 90% of the time working retail, my actual emotion was was anger. I just folded all those clothes. These people come in and mess them up, or but are you allowed to say to people, why are you yelling at people? No, you have to actually thank people for coming into your store and creating work for you. And again, you're not going to last long in retail if you're angry and you're yelling at people and you're calling them idiots and you're actually expressing your emotions. Same goes. I always crack up when I call to complain, maybe Verizon or something like that, and I'm kind of yelling at the person because Verizon once again messed up my bill or something like that. And I always think to myself, and I always say, listen, I have to yell at you. I know it's not your fault. You work for Verizon, but you know what? Hey, what do you want me to do? And then I love it. At the very end of the phone call, they're like, thank you so much for bringing your concern to us. And I'm thinking, they're going to hang up and go, I got to get a new job. So vocational display rules. And finally, what psychologists refer to the need of the moment display rules. Ladies and gentlemen, as we go through life, we learn, hey, when you're in this situation, show this emotion. When I'm in a job interview and they're saying, hey, the job is this, let's say I'm thinking, woo, I don't know if I can do that. If I want the job, what do I need to do? I need to put on my face a confident kind of like, yeah, sure, yeah, I've never done that, but I have an alternate skill set, and because what do we want to do? We want to convey confidence. A number of years ago, I was talking to some students, and they were telling me, it was after the summer, and so they worked on a rescue squad, so in an ambulance. And so they were talking about, and they'd done this for a couple of years, and they were talking about how they had a new trainee that was working with them. Okay, so imagine there's a car accident, you call 911, here comes the rescue squad, okay? Now, these are the people that are there to take care of things, right? The trainee, when she would get out of the ambulance, and it was a woman, would be like looking around, and the look on her face was like, oh my goodness, this is bad. Oh, wow. And they kept telling her, listen, you can't, I know it's a little freaky to see people bleeding and, it's a bad car accident, but you have to get the look off your face that this is serious. And, you need to convey to people, hey, we're here. It's bad, but we're going to do everything we possibly can to mitigate the situation. You don't want an ambulance driver or an EMT with a look of like, oh, looks bad. I mean, if you went into surgery, you don't want the doctor coming in going, ooh, I don't know, this looks bad. You'd be like, what? You already feel that way. You need them to bolster your confidence. And quite frankly, even if consciously you might think that EMT people have emotions, or nurses in the emergency room, it's got to be tough. But you know what? You don't want an emergency room nurse that's all like, yee, this looks bad. I don't know. Let's hope for the best. You'd be like, what? Take me to another hospital. So these 4 sets of display rules really govern, if you will, how we show emotion. 2 last things let's talk about. The third is, it's the hardest to explain. It's what we call the subjective experience or the emotional experience. This would be what we actually feel when we're sad, when we're happy, when we're anxious. It's the kind of feeling itself. And we call this the subjective feeling because you may say to me, I'm really anxious. Now, do I know how you're feeling? Think about it. No. At best, I have a general sense of how you're feeling. So if I say, hey, how you doing? You're like, I'm really anxious. Okay, this is what happens. You say the words, I'm really anxious. And then I think to myself, okay, Stephen, when you're really anxious, how do you feel? Therefore, this is how this person I'm talking to must feel. Now, there's a lot of leaps and assumptions being made there. Namely, when my really anxious is the same as you're really anxious. Now, let's just say that you're really anxious all the time. You're an anxious person. So you're really anxious is like off the charts anxiety because your normal is kind of anxious. Whereas let's say that I'm rarely anxious. And maybe my experience of really anxious to you is kind of mild. The reality is when we get right down to it, our emotional lives are experienced alone. Okay? I don't want to be all depressing here. But at best, we have a general sense, and we can be somewhat empathetic to each other. But how you really feel, so if someone tells you, oh, I know exactly how you feel, they don't. At best, they should say, I have an approximate sense of how you may feel. I mean, that's the best we can say. So the subjective feeling is something that is unique to each one of us. Now, the good news is that we, through our facial expressions and through our verbal expressions, we can communicate to each other, again, generally and maybe pretty accurately, where we are emotionally. But ultimately, it's subjective. And again, we could take any example, but let me just take the example of happiness. Psychologists have studied happiness. I love this picture. Those guys, especially the young boy at the bottom, that face, it's hard to imagine an expression of joy more than the boy in the light blue shirt down there. Psychologists have studied happiness a lot, and they've actually gotten rid of the word happiness because happiness, unfortunately, is a term that is so fuzzy, it's hard to know what we mean by that. So, again, psychologists have operationally defined happiness in this mouthful. They call it subjective well-being. Again, the word subjective there. And the sense of well-being, because in studying happiness, believe it or not, happiness is quite a lot about not being unhappy. Now you may say, well, wait, Murray, what are you talking about? No, when we think of happiness, we may think of a great joy, but a lot of actual happiness would be that I'm not miserable. So if I'm not suffering, and I'm not highly anxious, and I'm not worried, and I don't have a toothache, and I'm not worried about how I'm going to pay my rent and so on and so forth. Believe it or not, the great majority of happiness is just a general sense of well-being. Now, happiness does mean different things to different people, and that's what makes not just happiness, but any emotion difficult to measure. But because happiness is such an important thing, allegedly, for human beings, clearly psychologists have studied it among the other emotions. And so if you want to know how to be happy, I'm here to tell you that psychologists have discovered that some things do go along with happiness and others actually don't. So for instance, if you have high self-esteem, chances are you're happy. If you're an optimistic and outgoing and agreeable person, chances are you're also happy. If you have good emotionally close, satisfying relationships or a really good marriage, and by really good marriage, we're not talking about, your spouse is rich or your spouse, I don't know. No, there's a good emotional connection. You can share. When things are tough, you can tell this person what's on their mind. When you spend your days doing something you enjoy, that engages your skills, you feel accomplished. When you have a strong, meaningful faith, and when you sleep well, eat well, and exercise, all of those things seem to go with happiness. Now, do they cause happiness, or does happiness, go along with these things? We don't know. The cause and effect relationships are difficult here. But just take a meaningful religious faith. Early on in the history of psychology, most psychologists who were atheists tended to view religious people as a little bit wacko and nuts and neurotic. They're thinking about sin and, they're hell and, they waste all their time doing this and that, and the broad conclusion was, if you're religious, you're probably neurotic or a little bit nuts. Well, interestingly, the research shows exactly opposite consistently over time. We mentioned this in an earlier lecture that actually the more religious you are, generally speaking, the happier you tend to be. And ladies and gentlemen, this one good reason for this is that happiness tends not to be associated with having stuff, having fun, partying. Actually, happiness or well-being, if you pointed out anything, has to do with meaning in life. Meaning. And that kind of makes sense because religious people, if they have nothing else, tend to, their religion tends to strongly contribute to a sense of meaning and purpose. And when psychologists study happiness, meaning and purpose, if you have meaning and purpose in your life, even if there's a lot of stuff going wrong, chances are you'll be happy. Now, on the opposite, the right-hand side, believe it or not, age isn't highly correlated with happiness. In fact, the happiest people tend to be people in their 50s, if you want to talk about an age. Those of you that are in your 20s and teens, that's a tough time. There's a lot of stress on you that tends to get in the way of happiness. By the time you hit your 50s, you've made all those big decisions and maybe you've failed. You can't be an astronaut now, and then again, maybe you got married, but you're divorced. And the 50s are usually become before all the health problems that are associated with old age come along. Again, gender, males and females tend to be about equally happy. Now, women are twice as likely to be clinically depressed, but men are twice as likely to be alcoholics. So I just think that, depressed men are just drinking, and they're actually depressed. Education levels. Again, whether you're high school dropout to college, the happiest people actually tend to be people with a college degree. And it's not that you got a bachelor's degree and all of a sudden you're happier. It's that a college degree really allows you to get a job which maximizes the chance of using some skills. If you don't have a college degree, a lot of times the jobs you can get are tough. I've had those jobs. Having children or not actually is not correlated with happiness. That really surprised me when first time I read that, because being a father is certainly one of the greatest joys of my life. I love being a father. I still love being a father. But I have to admit that being a father has brought a fair amount of stress in my life too. Those times when I got calls from the police, so please come down to the police station. We have your son here. And and my children are older, but I'm still stressed by them. I worry about them, and I wonder if they're making the right decisions. And when they're going through a very, very hard time, I would rather go for a hard time by far than have my children going through a hard time and hearing about it. And lastly, if you're ridiculously good looking and you know who you are, you know what the research shows? You're no more happier than the rest of us. Now, if you're considered by the society you live in as very, very unattractive, you will be unhappy. Okay? The point I want to make here is that there are so many things that contribute to happiness one way or the other. It's really hard to measure it. Let me end this little thing, and we're almost done with our lecture here, by saying that there are two things that psychologists have found consistently, no matter where they go in the world and who they study, tend to be highly correlated with subjective well-being. And it's these two. Are you ready? Drum roll. If you're a thankful, grateful person, no matter what else is going on in your life, chances are you're happy. If you are a bitter, ungrateful person and you walk around thinking that everybody owes you something, the research shows almost guaranteed you're not a very happy person. So gratitude, a sense of gratitude is highly correlated with joy and happiness, regardless of everything else. The second thing, and this, again, is kind of interesting. If you go through life with high expectations that everything should be a particular way, chances are you're going to be unhappy. Why? Because the more expectations that you have about people around you in the world, that it should be this way. People should treat you with respect, and this meal that I just paid $50 for should taste really, really good, and my car should start in the morning, and this vacation that we're going on should be great because, I paid all this money. The more expectations you have, the more you open yourself up to disappointment. If you go through life with low expectations, if you, for instance, let me be extreme here. If you wake up in the morning and say, it's a beautiful day and thank God I'm alive and anything good that happens to me is just icing on the cake. It's going to be hard to be disappointed. Okay, so someone steps in front of you in line, at Starbucks, or your hamburger had a cockroach wing, in it, whatever. Now, you may not like that, but at least you're not all demanding. So people that are highly entitled and or have high expectations tend to be unhappy. Why? Simply because you present yourself in any given day, week, month, year, many, many more opportunities to be disappointed than if you said, you know what, this wasn't what I had hoped for, but you know what, it's still kind of cool. Okay, we're almost done here. Thanks for listening so far. But the last one here just would have to do emotional interpretation. And we are almost completely unaware of this. If I could just give you a few examples. Have you ever been, I don't know, thinking to yourself and maybe you're happy and it's almost like you have this internal conversation in your head. It's like, oh, why am I so happy? I'm not really happy today. Why? Now, that's kind of an interesting question. And you know what happens? Because you have a left hemisphere in your brain, I'm assuming, your brain will come up with a plausible reason why you're so happy. It's because of this, it's because of that. You will come up with an interpretation, and you will do that whether you're consciously aware of it or not. When you have an emotion, your brain almost by default comes up with an explanation of that. Or, the opposite may be true. I don't know, you may be like, maybe you're just having a tough day, and you're like, why? I don't really, today sucks. And again, you're not just going to say today sucks, there's no reason for it. Your left hemisphere is going to say, okay, why does today suck? And life being what it is, you'll have plenty of reasons for it, and you'll latch onto that as the explanation. But the research shows that often the explanation or reason we give ourselves for our happiness, the explanatory variable here, isn't necessarily the number one, or sometimes not even really connected. I've noticed about myself, particularly in the early spring, on the first 2 or 3 days in which the weather is in the high 60s or low 70s and the sun is out, I am irrationally happy. And it doesn't matter what else is going on in my life. I'm just irrationally happy. On Monday mornings, particularly on Monday morning, when my Mondays tend to be long, I'm not going to get home till 8 o'clock at night and it's 8 o'clock in the morning. And, let's say it's rainy and overcast and, I'm, and you may say, well, yeah, I mean, it's rainy, it's overcast, it's Monday, you have a whole week of work ahead of you and so on and so forth. There are good reasons for that. But really, Tuesdays are long days. Sometimes it's rainy. A Friday morning that's rainy and I have a long day, I just, so there are all kinds of ways in which the emotional interpretation of our, that our brain uses is accurate, but we have to admit, as the research shows, that we're not always accurate. Okay, thank you for listening this far. If you've gotten this far, then congratulations. You've listened to Mireille yap on for almost an hour. And I have the emotion right now of disappointment because when I began this, I thought, yeah, I can definitely do this in half an hour and stop subjecting these poor students to these long, drawn out, overly elaborate lectures. I'm going to say goodbye and go deal with my disappointment. I wonder what my left hemisphere is going to say is the real reason. Okay, till next time. Bye.